Basically, this is a snapshot of a story about the development of the Glasshouse Country Disaster Management Network, which has formed over the last 2.5 years, probably nearly 3 years now, showing some practical applications and learnings along the way. So this is a map that's been defined by community members who've been involved in this process across around 6 towns, usually between 5 and 10 minutes between each drive, and population between 800 people and 7,000 people. The blue area marks a local disaster management subgroup in the area, and then the broader area is all kinds of community organisations that came together for this process, and all of them are 100% volunteer run. So as a community development worker myself under the Caloundra Community Centre, working in the Glasshouse country area, we worked with a community development approach. So here's some key points which I'll just explain a little bit further of what we did in terms of community development principles. We're really focused on working with the people rather than for them. So this was a very organic process done in the time that worked for the people we're working with, in the right suitable locations. We looked at the regularity of meetings that was suitable and focusing on where they are at in their understanding and direction. This is where the value of locally based community development worker role came in to be particularly beneficial, because it was building on pre-existing relationships and trust and being able to commit to the community for the long term. The process included Sunshine Coast Council and Queensland Fire and Emergency Services. However, they were invited to the process to be involved. It wasn't led by them. So in terms of community participation, this didn't really exist before this process on the topic of disaster resilience. And there was no decision making in place, obviously. So the direction was based on how the community wanted it to go. And the community was a big part of developing the whole process. We looked at integrated holds, so inviting extensively across the area of community representative or people, and so everyone there identified who is missing, who else needed to be involved. So it was very much everyone having a say in keeping people together and having a good representation. Then we're looking at building on the capacity. So we had a process that facilitated community members to identify their own needs and interests, such as the decision to form a network and looking at kinds of training topics that they might be interested in. And then there was a big emphasis on relationship building, working together all the way through, and sharing power and resources. Empowerment was embedded in the process, and the community ownership in the process was just as, if not more so, important than the outcome. So the Glasshouse Country Disaster Management Network was created and held by the community members with a CD worker and structured with a volunteer coordination team. We also had the support of the local councillor and he's also a senior member on the Sunshine Coast Local Disaster Management Group, which was a great point of I guess, authority and support into what we were doing. And the network has developed a resource directory to allow groups resources to be shared. So this is, in a nutshell, a bit of a part of the community development process of how it all came about. Starting at the top left, we know there's been a human social recovery subgroup. So initially, I had no idea how disaster management arrangements work, but I was concerned that knowing we do get disasters and what happens, and if I don't know, well, I'm pretty sure other community members don't really know how things work. So So we identified, I was then able to link in with the recovery officer at the local council, become then around the table of the human social recovery subgroup to gain a better understanding of disaster management arrangements. And it was clear around that table that there was a lot of authorities and large organisations, but a lack of these smaller local community organisations who we work with closely through the community and neighbourhood centres. And there was a area of connection and knowledge that seemed to be a gap of all this local knowledge and these local groups really not having much connection. So typically in a community development, a good community development process, traditionally, I guess it's looking at coming from the needs of the people. But the difference here was there was no discussion. There was nothing that, it didn't start from being, it needed a proactive spark, I guess. So we needed to raise the issue with people to start thinking about disaster management in the first place. So we had discussions around the table talking about things like raising the awareness of the increased severity and frequency of natural disasters. There was a clear initial point of complacency about the topic. People saying things like, oh, it doesn't really affect us when we're talking about our groups. But once we started throwing around a few scenarios and ideas of, well, what if we really were stuck and other services were cut off and they weren't able to come in? That sparked some interest in going, okay, maybe we should start talking about this. So collectively, as many people, it was their choice to say, yes, let's come together. So then worked with council, QFES and community members to collaborate and come together and start to run some workshops. So this was the first workshop, and there was a variety of groups, local groups and services coming along, and we basically structured the workshop.
Natasha, can I just ask one question?
Yes, please do.
You mentioned the local councillor, and I assume that was Rick Babarowski.
Yes.
Did you have officers from the council as well? Or?
Yes, we did. So we had the disaster resilience officer, and the recovery officer was also linked in, knowing about the conversation, but wasn't needing to be directly in. Actually, she was in the very first workshop. She was part of planning it, but then stepped back and let it be with the disaster resilience officer. And then we had the community engagement officer from QFES linked in with that. So that's where that was quite a structured workshop to first go through disaster management arrangements, because pretty much everyone in the room said they had no idea what the disaster management arrangements were. So council and QFES were able to speak with authority on that and show all of their information. And that was a significant community education process. That's one of the things that I think was most beneficial out of the whole thing, was people suddenly getting it and aware of what disaster management processes looks like, and having a bit of an idea of what they don't need to worry about, that the services have got it under control. But also then we went into to looking at scenarios. So I'll just skip over to that. So this was, I guess, interestingly, each time we came together, there was a natural disaster literally happening or has just happened. And that wasn't planned, but it just highlighted, look, this is actually important. It is happening around us. So the first workshop was around just soon after the time of Cyclone Omar. And we were able to show weather maps that showed that the cyclone was on its path to hit our local area. We were just very fortunate that it took a different turn and went out to sea. So we were able to work with something that was a situation where we can go, that could have been us. So we looked at the potential risks that would have faced the local community if that cyclone did hit, and also what resources the local groups had, and this is key, what resources the local groups had amongst them that could possibly be used. Now, this was the first time these people, all community members, had actually considered this properly. So we had all kinds of things, from barbecues to teams of volunteers to rooms, kitchens, fridges, all kinds of things. Local environment groups, they've got safety gear, they've got all kinds of things. So that really sparked the movement of, okay, let's all work together. It shifted, light bulbs went off at that time to see the relevance of why we need to have these conversations. And they saw that they have a role, they can have a role, they have resources, and as I said, a reason to connect about this issue. They gained awareness and was, as I said, sparked the conversation. And really it was the turning point, that first workshop. So soon after that, one of the things raised that organisations felt they need was organisational resilience planning, like business continuity planning. So QFES run these workshops, and we had a range of organisations, particularly all the local neighbourhood centres, down at this workshop, and went through a workbook and was led through that process. And then I, as the local community development worker, had follow-up sessions with these organisations to continue work on those plans. And then we had another workshop, a second workshop, that was around time of bushfires in our area. We discussed options on how we will collaborate moving forward. So the big decision was, will we be a formal local disaster management group community subgroup, which there are many that exist, or will we do something different, make it up, and that be, we decided, that be a network, a semi-loose network of groups. There's a lot of work that goes into being a subgroup of an LDMG, and really people came and said, we don't want all this extra work. We just want to do what we can to be more resilient. So the decision was clearly made that they form a community network, and I'll go into what that has looked like over the time. So there was work on forming the foundations of the network. So the foundations looked like a contacts directory of 2 people from each group, and that forming into a contacts directory of all the groups in Glasshouse country. A resources directory, as I mentioned, all the resources that they raised, that formed into, then we had a form for each group to fill in and formally put forward what resources they could have available if called on. And then we formed a community-led, so it was a community-led leadership structure with a coordination team. So we had a representative from each of the local towns to come together as a leadership team. And they are now holding the space of this, so organising the meetings, but I'm in there with them supporting that. And basically being the point of maintaining, further developing and maintaining these resources. We also developed a quite detailed handbook of all the components of this network, who's all the different roles, and a brief overview of disaster management arrangements and some key contacts for emergency services. So that is actually on a website that I'll show you shortly that is available to download as a sample. And then we have a diagram, which we spent a lot of time on, of working out the communication channels so it's clear for everyone. They're not all to go and contact all the different agencies themselves and who's doing what. We needed a diagram to visualize that. Then it came to encouraging local groups to do what they can. So here's an example. The Glasshouse Mountains Neighbourhood Centre hosted a bushfire preparedness session, which was very well timed around bushfire season, and there were active bushfires in those weeks. So the local RFS came in and did a presentation, had a great display, and everyone was very motivated to come. It was interesting, we had a full hall that day. If we held this earlier in the year, in cyclone season, for example, I think we probably would have got less than half this number of people. So then we went into a third workshop, really clarifying the purpose of the network with further details on the function of the network. So we developed then a terms of reference, which is all in that handbook, and more work on the contents of this handbook. and identified the future development of the network. So we talked about ideas of who could be guest speakers and what's relevant for keeping people to come along to these meetings. Here's a sample of the contact directory. So this is, your core number 1, number 2 contacts. And we have on the right-hand side, we've got names of current pending. That's the people on the coordination team, for everyone to know where it's at with keeping those contacts up to date. And then we have the resource directory. So this is a few snippets of samples, and we've got it in 3 categories of infrastructure, environment, and the human social, and all kinds of things in there with, as I mentioned before, tools, barbecues, all kinds of things. And then this is an example. This is really the start of the handbook, and that's also showing that communications channels diagram, which really has the pyramid of disaster management, and then in the main orange circle as that leadership coordination team, and showing that the flow of information can go in between members, and then members can help get messages out to the broader community. And a key message with that through the authorities has always been just share from the authorities directly. Don't add anything to it. Just share the core messages that the likes of from the LDMG and QFES. And right at the start of the handbook has been the most important piece, which is the key contacts for anyone to call, and for people to share with other people in the community if they're not aware, who are the points of contact, because that has been a major downfall in past disasters of people running around not knowing who to contact. Also, we've had information sheets developed for member groups to really explain the role of, say, the coordination team. There's another one that shares how they can let their local volunteers in their groups know about this network. So that's designed for them. And then also on the right here, a sample of the forms that community groups fill in. So it's all tried to be kept really simple and just emailed through. And we've also developed a website. So this has core information, the download of the handbook, some of the quick links for key contacts, and really a bit of an overview of what this whole network is about. Just added this in here because this has been able to be linked with the the state neighbourhood centres strategies for disaster resilience in terms of being used as a case study and just part of the broader movement of trying to build that community resilience through neighbourhood centres, as this has happened as the work of a community development worker through a neighbourhood centre. Actually, I might just go back there. There's a key point that I've raised at conferences before on this, and that is the question of who is to do this work. The community-led disaster planning work is widely spoken about as being very important, and one of the key learnings that's come out of so many disasters is the importance of community-led disaster planning. But when it comes down to it, what do we see on the ground? There's not a lot of this happening, and I think one of the key issues with that is that question: who is actually best placed to do this work? In my mind, I see neighbourhood centres as one avenue to do that, because we have the relationships on the ground. We do group work, we're trusted, and we often will have community development and or facilitation skills to be able to draw people together. So currently there's no clear answer on this, and that's why I think the ball gets dropped on in this area. So something to think about. We had this is the leadership team, the coordination team of community members, and sitting around with the head of the Sunshine Coast LDMG and our disaster resilience officer, planning together a later stage workshop. So it was great support there with council. And then we went through, and because we were working with the expertise of council, they were able to run a desktop exercise on a disaster that had happened in a few years beforehand. And so we went through, and this is what was absolutely fundamental to the development of the network. Throughout it, that we had issues with uncertainty of what is the core purpose and how does this network function. And that was partly to do with, we were developing this as we went, and it was still being refined. This is the thing that made all the difference. Once we had this desktop exercise and went through what would everyone do in this situation, it was clear as mud. We had it very strongly put that we know the communication channels, and that is for everyone to know to contact the authorities, particularly the local council who run the LDMG, and everything gets coordinated through the Disaster Coordination Centre. And after we had to rumble through this quite a bit, but after we did that, people were clear. And we have food as a half an hour session at the end of each time we come together. We only come together, have been 4 times a year. This year it's going to be 3 times a year. So yeah, that importance of having that social element is right up there.
Natasha, who was the facilitator for that scenario session?
So that was the Disaster Resilience Officer.
From the council? From
the council. And I kind of, with myself and her, we shared kind of facilitating that whole event. But now the good thing is we've worked into the core community members. They are now standing up and they are speaking to each section of the meetings. So that's happened since our last meeting. We just actually had a planning meeting yesterday, and they're right up for it. And so next, all the future sessions, it's going to be the community members standing up, and really we've planned that together, and they're running these meetings now, which is really exciting. Just a little bit of an overview here in the stages of the network. Development and refinement, because as I said, it's been an organic process. We've been learning as we go. So initially we had the contact and resource directory for all groups and for the LDMG to use. So we get our core document together, we send it to the LDMG in the time of a disaster. They know that if they need extra localized information, or if their resources, if their emergency services are running thin on the ground, that they can call. Not that we're going to get out there and fight the fires, but they know that if the whole Sunshine Coast, for example, gets hit and the emergency services are swamped and all of the different pieces are really tight, that they can call and at least ask our local groups, could we get some extra support? Could we have, like, the likes of CWA making some extra food for frontline volunteers, or can we use your building or whatever it is for extra room, particularly in the case of places of refuge, where people might need a place to go just for a day. And yeah, that's been highlighted as what could be very much in need is, and that's where neighbourhood centres could come in. Might not necessarily be set up for being an evacuation centre, but might be able to hold a few people safe for a day. So then another key point was in the blue, going into the initial scenario response planning. We identified through this communication channels are central to the network's function. So in that, we did start to play with the idea of, should we go into scenario planning and really look at, okay, if a flood or a fire hit these areas, what are all the different details we should be looking at in terms of response? But we really came clear that we don't need to go into that detail. We just need to know the communication channels. Generally, it's, and go through the authorities. And worst comes to worst, if the authorities, something happens for whatever reason and all systems are shut down and access is shut down, at least we've got our contact directory and our resource directory in place for our own use, and we can use that if we need to. But generally, we just go through the LDMG. So that's why that communication channels proved to be like the most important piece that we needed to really refine, so everyone knows communication. And then we went into, we had the impetus to form the coordination team and communications collateral to basically reinstate what we decided, that it's really about communications channels. And we had core roles within the coordination team built up, like defined. Mainly it really came down to each person knowing that they'll be the lead person of contacting the groups in their local towns that they represented, and that we hold the directory just within the coordination team. Originally it was thought, should we spread it out to everybody? We thought actually it could get into a tricky point there with some people using it for purposes that it's not designed for. It's primarily designed to inform the LDMG. So that core resources document of everyone's details is kept confidential through the coordination team. And then the LDMG can put direct call outs to groups. And then that last bit, were refinements to the communications collateral and a guide for referring community to the authorities. So we had to refine our handbook to really say, what's the role of groups and what's the process if you're called on to help, that kind of thing. So after 2.5 years of working through a process, we came to a fairly simple solution, and that was that all groups contribute to the development. All groups did contribute to the development of the network over time, but the core cogs in the wheel really is that the community groups provide 2 contacts and their resource list, and the groups refer calls of support to council or other authorities. Then we've got the coordination team to maintain the directory and host the meetings. And we've got the LDMG to use the directory as additional support and local intel if needed. That's it. So we've really been able to keep it where groups aren't feeling like they're needing to be more committed than what they feel they can be. So some key challenges in all of this time, I guess, was clarity of roles. So community members having understanding of what they do and don't have responsibility for. The scope creep, the less defined the function of the network was, the greater risk there was of the roles and responsibilities to expand out. So we had to really tighten that. Inconsistency, so the risk of that inconsistency of who is in the room, that is always going to happen, where we've got people who can come sometimes, can't come other times. That was difficult because you had to catch people up in the conversation if they hadn't been there before, and things could go on a tangent. So we had to really work with that one. And we decided that as a consistent measure at the start of every meeting, there's a standard set of information that's given about the background and the purpose of the network, and a short overview of a scenario which reinstates the communication channels. Collective mindsets versus individual mindsets, that's something we had to work with. We had some people clear that this is a Glasshouse country, kind of regional approach, but you still got those people coming, talking about their backyard. So we had to manage that one. It was a first time process, so we had changes along the way, and maintaining momentum over time. We've had to really work at making sure it stays relevant for people to come along. Okay, now it's suddenly, there we go. Key strengths of the network has been the community development approach, keeping messages simple and the process as simple as possible, the emphasis on collaboration and relationship building, making sure we're timing it well, and knowing that it does take time. I think someone needs to mute. And there's the trust in each other and having clear communication and community leadership. Just about finished, and that's pretty much it. So I guess the key point, one of the key points I'd like to finish on was really that this is a process that community members feel like and can say this has been their process, their achievements. They feel proud of what's been developed and feel comfortable in their capacity to do what's needed to be done. They don't feel like it's onerous, which was a big need at the start of what they were saying. And we've had volunteer members saying things like, this is the most important thing and we should be doing, and we all have a role to play. So quite a shift from the first discussions that we had in the early part of the process.